At the dawn of the 20th century, the island city of Galveston, Texas, was a place of boundless optimism and staggering wealth. It was widely known as the New York of the South, a glittering cosmopolitan hub built on a narrow barrier island just off the Texas coast. Thanks to its deep-water port, it was the second busiest immigration entry point in the United States and the undisputed cotton capital of the world. Mansions lined the broad avenues, electric streetcars rattled past bustling theaters, and the first millionaires in Texas proudly called the island home. But Galveston had a fatal geographic flaw. The entire city was built on a shifting sandbar. At its absolute highest point, the island was only 8.7 feet above sea level. Most of the city sat just a few feet above the warm, green waters of the Gulf of Mexico. For years, visiting engineers and cautious locals had warned that the city was dangerously exposed to the violent tropical cyclones that routinely spun out of the Caribbean. They pleaded with the city leaders to build a seawall to protect the booming metropolis. But the wealthy merchants and politicians of Galveston dismissed the idea as far too expensive and entirely unnecessary. They were backed by the highest scientific authority in the city, Isaac Monroe Klein, the chief meteorologist of the local United States Weather Bureau. In 1891, Klein had written an influential article in the local newspaper definitively stating that the idea of a hurricane severely damaging Galveston was a crazy delusion. He argued that the shallow slope of the seafloor off the coast of Texas would naturally diffuse the power of any incoming storm surge. In the age of steam engines, telegraphs, and electric lights, the men of Galveston believed they had mastered nature. They were completely wrong. In late August of 1900, a tropical disturbance drifted off the west coast of Africa and began the long journey across the Atlantic. By early September, it had passed over Cuba as a heavy tropical storm. At the time, the pioneers of hurricane tracking were the meteorologists of the Balin College Observatory in Havana. The Cuban scientists had spent decades studying the unique atmospheric patterns of the Caribbean, and they recognized immediately that the storm was intensifying and curving toward the Gulf of Mexico. But the central office of the United States Weather Bureau in Washington, D.C., was locked in a bitter, arrogant rivalry with the Cuban forecasters. The American director of the Bureau, Willis Moore, had gone so far as to ban all telegraph cables from the Cuban scientists, claiming their methods were unscientific and alarmist. The Washington office confidently predicted that the storm would turn northeast, sweep up the Atlantic coast of Florida, and harmlessly blow itself out over the open ocean. Because of this bureaucratic arrogance, the storm slipped into the superheated waters of the Gulf of Mexico entirely unnoticed by the American government. Feeding on the warm water, it rapidly exploded into a Category 4 hurricane, and it was moving directly toward the coast of Texas. In Galveston, the morning of Friday, September 7th, broke with an eerie, oppressive stillness. The telltale signs of an impending hurricane, darkening skies, and dropping barometric pressure were initially entirely absent. But Isaac Klein began to notice something deeply troubling. Standing on the beach, he watched massive, heavy sea swells rolling in from the southeast, crashing against the sand at intervals of 1 to 5 minutes. The waves were pushing water into the low-lying areas of the city, flooding streets 3 to 4 blocks inland. What unnerved Klein was that these massive swells were rolling in against the direction of the prevailing winds. It defied everything he knew about local weather patterns. By the early hours of Saturday, September 8th, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. The tide was coming in incredibly high, and the wind began to howl out of the north. In his memoirs, Isaac Klein claimed that he realized the Washington Weather Bureau was wrong and took it upon himself to raise the red and black hurricane warning flags over the city, defying protocol. He also claimed he hitched his horse to a two-wheeled cart and rode furiously up and down the beaches, screaming for people to evacuate to higher ground or cross the bridges to the mainland. While historians have debated the extent of his warnings, one thing is certain. By the time the people of Galveston realized the danger they were in, the bridges to the mainland had been washed away by the rising tide. 30,000 people were trapped on a flat bar of sand. By mid-afternoon, the skies over Galveston had turned the color of bruised iron. The wind steadily escalated, shrieking through the telegraph wires and tearing the heavy slate shingles off the roofs of the mansions, turning them into flying guillotines. Then the true horror of the hurricane arrived. It was not the wind that destroyed Galveston, it was the water. Pushed by sustained winds of 140 miles per hour, the Gulf of Mexico simply rose up and swallowed the island. A massive, churning storm surge, estimated to be over 15 feet high, rolled over the city. Because the highest point on the island was barely 9 feet above sea level, every single inch of Galveston was plunged violently underwater. The water moved with the force of a battering ram. As the wooden houses on the beachfront were ripped from their foundations, they did not just float away. They were caught in the roaring current and smashed into the houses behind them. This created a cascading domino effect of destruction. A massive wall of grinding timber, furniture, slate, and shattered homes, stretching for miles and standing 2 stories high, began to bulldoze its way across the island, crushing everything in its path. Thousands of terrified residents fled to the grandest, sturdiest brick homes in the center of the city, packing hundreds of people into single houses. But the storm surge was merciless. The water relentlessly undermined the brick foundations until the massive structures simply collapsed inward, trapping the refugees in the dark, churning water. One of the most heartbreaking tragedies of the storm occurred just 3 miles down the beach, at the St. Mary's Orphan Asylum. The orphanage was run by the Sisters of Charity and was home to 93 children and 10 nuns. As the storm surge began to tear the heavy wooden buildings apart, the sisters realized that the structures were going to fail. In a desperate, valiant attempt to save the children, the nuns gathered clotheslines. Each nun tied a thick rope around her own waist, and then tied the other end to the wrists of 6 to 8 small children, tethering them together so no one would be swept away in the dark. But human strength was no match for the fury of the Gulf. The buildings were completely obliterated, washed out to sea in a matter of minutes. Tragically, the ropes meant to save them sealed their fate. Only 3 older boys, who had managed to climb into the branches of a sturdy tree, survived the night. Days later, when the rescue crews finally reached the ruins of the orphanage, they found the nuns buried in the sand, still permanently tethered to the bodies of the children they had tried so desperately to protect. Back in the center of the city, Isaac Klein, the meteorologist who had once claimed a hurricane could never destroy Galveston, was fighting for his life. His own house was one of the strongest wooden structures in the city, built to withstand heavy winds. Over 50 terrified neighbors had taken refuge inside, including Klein's pregnant wife, Cora, his 3 young daughters, and his brother Joseph. For hours, the house held against the raging water. But around 8 o'clock that evening, a massive section of a destroyed railroad trestle was caught in the current and slammed violently into the side of the home. The house shuddered, rolled over, and plunged into the surging floodwaters. Isaac Klein was briefly pinned underwater by the shifting timbers before miraculously breaking free and surfacing. In the pitch-black, roaring chaos, he managed to find his brother and his 3 daughters clinging to a piece of floating wreckage. But Cora was gone. They drifted on the massive debris pile for hours, listening to the screams of their neighbors dying in the darkness, unable to see anything, battered by flying wood and freezing rain. By dawn on Sunday, September 9th, the wind finally died down, and the waters began to recede back into the Gulf. The sun rose over a landscape that was entirely unrecognizable. Galveston, the glittering New York of the South, had been wiped off the map. A massive, 3-mile-long wall of pulverized wreckage, packed tightly with the bodies of the dead and the carcasses of drowned horses and cattle, cut through the center of the ruined island. The stench of salt, mud, and death was overpowering. The death toll was apocalyptic. It is estimated that between 6,000 and 8,000 people were killed in a single night. Roughly 1 in every 5 people on the island perished. To this day, the Galveston hurricane of 1900 remains the deadliest natural disaster in the history of the United States. It killed more people than the San Francisco earthquake, the Johnstown flood, and Hurricane Katrina combined. The aftermath of the storm was a descent into a different kind of hell. The surviving population was utterly cut off from the mainland, without fresh water, food, or medical supplies. The sheer number of corpses scattered across the island created an immediate, terrifying threat of cholera and disease. Initially, the city officials tried to bury the dead at sea. They loaded hundreds of bodies onto barges, towed them out into the Gulf, weighted them down, and threw them overboard. But a few days later, the tides shifted, and the bodies washed right back onto the beaches of the ruined city. With the ground too saturated to dig graves, the survivors were forced to make a grim, agonizing decision. They built massive funeral pyres out of the wreckage of their own homes. For weeks, the skies over Galveston were choked with the thick, black smoke of burning bodies. Men were conscripted at gunpoint and forced to drink whiskey just to endure the psychological horror of throwing the bodies of their friends and neighbors into the fires. A month later, Isaac Klein was walking through the wreckage when the recovery crews finally found the body of his pregnant wife, Cora, buried beneath the debris of what had once been their home. But the story of Galveston does not end in complete despair. Out of the unimaginable ruin, the survivors decided they would not abandon their island. They would stay, and they would fight the sea. What followed was one of the most audacious and staggering feats of civil engineering in American history. Realizing they could never survive another storm of that magnitude, the city commissioned the construction of a massive, solid, concrete seawall. It stretched for miles along the coastline, standing 17 feet high and 16 feet thick at the base. It was a brutal, curving fortress designed to catch and deflect the power of a storm surge back into the ocean. But the seawall was only half the solution. If water did manage to breach the wall, the city would still flood. So, the engineers decided to do something that seemed impossible. They decided to physically raise the entire city of Galveston into the air. Using hundreds of manual jacks, workers slowly lifted every surviving building, house, church, and even the underground plumbing, high into the air on wooden stilts. Then, they brought in massive dredges from Europe to pump millions of cubic yards of sand from the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico directly underneath the elevated buildings. They literally changed the topography of the island, raising the ground level of the entire city by as much as 17 feet, creating a gentle slope that would allow water to drain harmlessly back into the sea. The engineering marvel worked. In 1915, another massive Category 4 hurricane struck Galveston head-on. The storm was remarkably similar in strength to the one in 1900. But this time, the seawall held. The raised city drained the water. Only 53 people lost their lives, proving that while nature could not be tamed, it could, with enough concrete and sheer human will, be survived. However, the 1900 storm had permanently altered the trajectory of Texas history. In the years following the disaster, investors and shipping companies grew too terrified of the exposed island. They moved their money, their ports, and their railroads 50 miles inland to a small, sleepy bayou town that was safely protected from the hurricanes. That town was Houston, which quickly exploded into the massive, sprawling metropolis it is today. Galveston survived, and it rebuilt its beautiful homes and bustling beaches. But it never reclaimed its crown as the premier city of the South. The island remains a quiet, resilient place, permanently defined by the massive concrete wall that guards its coast and the invisible scars of a September night when the ocean rose up and demanded a terrible price for human arrogance.